pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And we will go on to item number 3 on the agenda, and that's public comment. I didn't have anyone approach me as to provide public comment, and no one approached the clerk. So we'll move on to item number 4, approval of the May 11th, 2023 Executive Committee meeting minutes, and they were in your packet. What is your pleasure? Motion by Vice Chair McEwen and second by Supervisor Robinson. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion to approve the May 11th, 2023 Executive Committee meeting minutes signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. Motion carries and is unanimous. Let's move on to item number 5, policy issue discussion and potential committee determination. And under 5A is a continued discussion regarding the 2024 annual budget and policy recommendations from the committee. Under that is mandatory versus non-mandatory programs, fees, uses of fees and rates, and understanding the department's use of levy. I think one of the things that we have heard resoundingly through all of the standing committees is there is still continued discussion and struggle to understand some of the challenges, and we will be talking about that further, and some of the struggles under item number 6A1. So unless there's some input directly relating to items 5A1, 2, or 3, we'll move on. Anybody have any strong opinions of inputs right now for items 5A, 1, 2, or 3? Okay. We'll move on then to operational functions required by statute, ordinance, resolution, or policy. And under 5A, discussion and possible action by executive committee. Item 5A1 is a discussion of a letter supporting the funding of the University Alliance program in 2023 through 2025 state budget. Lance, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This really is very similar to the next item on your agenda that I believe was initiated by Supervisor Langenhan. But in short, I was contacted on May 10th by the director of the university program, the Alliance program, Gavin Luter, inquiring if Marathon County and specifically myself would be willing to author a letter in support of funding through the state budget process for the university program. Specifically, the state budget, the request from the program was $600,000, I believe. Being that it was May 10th, I couldn't get it on your meeting date agenda, which was the following day. Based on the open meetings and agenda posting rules. So this is the soonest I could get in front of this committee. Again, they're essentially asking for that letter of support. Marathon County did participate, as you all know, in the university program. In 2020 is when our project began. It went through 2022. We submitted a total of 38 projects to that program in a wide variety of areas. But the underlying idea of that alliance is the opportunity for local governments to partner with the university system to address challenging issues or identify issues and investigate potential solutions to some of those challenges through that partnership with the university system. So our 38 projects ranged from items related to the delivery of emergency medical services. Public safety had a couple of presentations that were the result of that. We had criminal justice system related projects, a wide variety of those, trying to help us identify how our programs, specifically drug court, OWI court, our SSTOP program, how they're functioning, identifying key performance indicators, We had programs relative to economic development, which were in partnership with somewhat in partnership with the city of Wausau, examining our bicycle network, infill and redevelopment opportunities within the Wausau MPO district, sustainability projects related to the use of road salt. So a wide variety of programs or issues that were identified through that process. Now, why am I asking for some guidance from this committee? My position is that as staff, we don't weigh in on the state budget. That's a policy decision for the elected officials. The only time we do that as staff is after you provide us that clear guidance on what position, if any, you want us to take. So just for, again, additional examples of context, we've had staff testify very recently at the state seeking funding for the expanded pilot within the Fenwood, but that was after engaging ERC and having those conversations. So you're my committee of oversight. If you'd ask me to draft a letter to Joint Finance, which was the request from the University Alliance Program Director, I'd be happy to do that, saying that we had a strong experience with the program. I think that's accurate. We had a lot of information that was garnered through that partnership, but I'm not going to do so unless you provide me that direction. So that's the nature of the request, Mr. Chair, and happy to answer any questions people might have.
So questions by the committee. I think one of the things that, comes to my mind was the value that was received by the county for the information that was received, was that of significant value in excess of the dollar cost in comparison to trying to get that information some other way. And I think, to my understanding, the information that we received was significantly valuable and was significantly cheaper than if we were going to go out and request to gather that information through internal means and or external means. But that's my take on it. So I would be in support of sending a letter of support. But that's my thoughts. I open it up for discussion from the committee. Supervisor Dickinson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 2 questions. Who determined the submission areas, the questions, the 38 areas, and then how much have we paid over the 3 years?
So the submission areas were part of our initial application, and I can talk about some of them. How we looked at them were the criminal justice system or evidence-based decision-making. We had some economic development projects, emergency medical projects. Those all came from staff or partners. We did ask
Committees.
the other committees, I think, to weigh in on that. I can answer more specifically with respect to cost. The program itself costs, all the municipalities have to put in $100,000. So that was approved by the board in 2020 when we started that project. As it relates to your specific question, Mr. Chair, on return on investment, we didn't do a formal evaluation of was there significant return on investment. I just say the one project that I thought was really helpful, that they did a significant amount of work, I know, and I dealt with directly, was our evaluation of our Start Right program, and that actually led us, it aligned very well with the results, some of the areas or challenges that were identified by the program led us to where we identified, hey, there's another opportunity with relative to nurse home visiting, and that was the nurse family partnership model. But all the projects that were identified were listed. They were categorized by the University Alliance program. They're online. Those weren't necessarily the categories that we identified, but the district attorney's office had some programs that they identified as well. But in total, there were 38. My recollection is they didn't match all 38 requests with staff, but well in excess of 30 projects were were matched. And that, from our side, the staff that led the program was really through Conservation Planning and Zoning. Planning Manager Dave Mack kind of took the lead on a lot of that coordination.
Other questions or comments? I think there was a significant that centered around the public safety and public the justice system, and it assisted. I think in some cases it assisted in the system-wide budgeting that we actually asked the administrator to look at and implement around the criminal justice system. Supervisor Robinson, please.
Does this need to go to the board, or is this a executive committee decision?
My sense is that this is the ask is really to allow me to author a letter. If you want to go to the board, that's fine. You're my committee of oversight. I think historically our practice has been, it's really through the committee of jurisdiction. I'm thinking back to staff from Conservation Planning and Zoning, kind of the desire or expectation that they try to expand funding for the Fenwood Creek project. That was really just through ERC where they've had the discussions. I don't recall the county board weighing in on staff testifying for a request for funding through the state of Wisconsin. But again, I take direction from this committee, so if the desire is to have the full board look at it, that's certainly fine.
Supervisor Robinson, please.
I would move to authorize the administrator to write a letter of support for funding for the University City Alliance program.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Van Cray. Excuse me. Yeah. Any further discussion? Supervisor Dickinson, please.
So how much money are they asking for? Did you say $600,000?
Statewide, for statewide implementation.
For statewide funds of 600. So I guess I'm not really in support because it's such a small amount of money, and it's a program that's, kind of running on its own. And yeah, they're looking for a letter of recommendation, but I mean, how often do we get requests like this from other entities? And, I'm sure there's some we turn down or some that don't come in. And I mean, I get it. But I don't know. To me, I think they can do well on their own for that amount of money. If it was $6 million, $60 million, I think that would be a different thought.
Other discussion? Any other discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor of the motion to approve and authorize the administrator to write a letter in support, signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. No. And the motion carries and is not unanimous. So thank you. And we will move on to item number 6A2. And just to inform the committee, the chair of the committee has requested to pull that item and send it back to for additional debate and discussion at the committee level. So that item has been pulled. So we'll move on to item 6A3, consideration and requesting administration to investigate strategies to develop program-specific expenses and revenue data. And this is coming out of one of the items that has been identified pretty much by every one of the program committees as an item that potentially is something that is needed if we're going to have continued discussions on programs. However, I think there's some challenges, and I'll refer to the administrator for additional elaboration.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As Chair Gibbs referenced, this is really one of those recurring themes, for lack of a better term, that's come up at each of the standing committee during the discussions relative to the budget. The idea being, we put together this mandatory and discretionary program list, and we have our budget. However, what we don't have is a budget that links directly, and it provides information relative to the specific costs for the various programs. And I've tried to explain our budgeting process utilizing the Counties Association Handbook and the various types of budgeting that are available, and the specific method we use here in Marathon County, and that is the kind of the line item budgeting process, and the fact that it makes difficult the allocation of those line items to specific programs. So there are ways to do that, and as I've explained at all the committees, all of them that I'm aware of right now rely upon underlying algorithms or assumptions relative to the allocation of costs, whether it be personnel, something as simple as supplies like paper, and of course overhead within our internal support departments. Priority-based budgeting was an initiative that started a number of years ago. However, the data within that system is not conducive to giving good information relative to the programs, particularly in light of the fact that the mandatory and discretionary program list that we tried to provide, that we did provide all the committees, is at a higher level than some of the programs that were initially identified in that priority-based budgeting process. So the thought being, do you want me to investigate strategies to develop that program-specific expense and revenue data? I can tell you I took a very small step to do that in advance of this meeting, just to kind of test the waters. I participate in a weekly call with my colleagues on Mondays, and I did that this morning. There's about any given Monday between 10 and 20 administrators that participate in that call. And I just explained the challenge that we have, kind of the desire that was expressed in these various committee meetings, and I inquired if any county has in fact moved to that program-based budgeting approach, and unfortunately no one had any great insights for me. No one indicated that they had moved in that direction. I can investigate what strategies might be out there in the rest of Wisconsin. Again, I do know priority-based budgeting can do that. So if you're interested in it, I can develop some strategies as to how to get there, and also put together a plan of action to get to that point, because I do sense that was a pretty consistent theme across the committees. So that's all, Mr. Chair. Happy to answer any questions or provide any additional information I can at this point, but that's kind of where we are.
Okay. Supervisor Robinson.
Yeah, I know that the DNR, they used PeopleSoft, which is what the state used, and there were elaborate activity codes to try to track expenditures and revenues by program area. For instance, you'd have certain grant-funded projects. You may have an Ashland Superfund site would have its own activity code, and you would put things in there, and you would track expenses, as well as staff time associated with it. I don't know the capacity of Workday, but is there the ability to develop and refine a number of activities? I know that we have to do that at infrastructure in the highway department for different things. So do we have the makings for that type of a system within Workday? And obviously we have to record it for the GTA and break it down for the state contract and others. So do we have the underpinnings to do that?
I can look into that. Certainly, Workday has some functionality that we're not utilizing right now. We have gotten some feedback that our ability to code things to specific activities is different than we had done it historically. I will say, to build on your example of highway, within the highway department, we code for specific activities on the state side. There would be a significant behavior change to code for all the activities on the county side. And within infrastructure, the example we used and that I and Jim used was tree management on roadways. We don't code for that. And there is, certainly it's a data, we can start to get all sorts of data for you. My only challenge is does it provide you significant actionable insight to justify the manual cost to do that. But I can look into Workday specifically and have that conversation with our team.
Follow-up, Supervisor Robinson, please go ahead.
I think you want to be careful not to get into too much minutia, because if the more confusing it is, the less likely there is to have compliance. But if we could go into some broader categories, I know Supervisor Dickinson has been asking for cost relative to certain program areas. I don't know that we have to drill down into sign installation versus tree cutting, but maybe we could have some broader categories that would capture. But it'd be nice to get winter maintenance, summer maintenance, and looking at what we've got. But I think that there's opportunity. Until we do that, it's really going to make programmatic evaluation of programs difficult. So if you're looking for direction, I support it. And I don't know if you're looking for a motion and a directive.
I think a motion would be good. I mean, I can look into, as we're having this conversation, one of the challenges with priority-based budgeting, I think it has a lot on the back end that's very positive. It walks you through essentially the development of, or the execution of those algorithms that I talked about, of allocating, even within the highway department, allocating Jim's time, some of his supervisors' time to the various programs. This is my assessment of our work with priority-based budgeting. It's kind of a pendulum. We started with a very granular, to your point, breakdown of programs. In fact, far too granular. So if we want to continue using priority-based budgeting, I can come back with an assessment of that versus Workday and see, at least for those two, and see if there are other opportunities. But it's going to take a considerable amount of work. I certainly don't think it's going to happen this year, but I can build that build a plan if you want to look at that for next year.
I think there's a couple of challenges that we need to be cognizant of. I support the idea of getting that information, but we also need to be cognizant of, the one department that should be leading that, or leading, if we're going to go down to, reutilizing priority-based budgeting, which means a reinventing that program. The department that should be leading that would be the finance department. Finance department's clearly still involved heavily in implementation of Workday. We are not anywhere close to completion of implementation of Workday. We hear that. I hear that at CCIT, in the CCIT meetings. We hear it from from Christy, from the finance department, the treasurer. There's still plenty of things that need to be implemented before it is fully functional, and all of the abilities that Workday provides is being brought forward and utilized and available to us as decision makers. So I just caution that there's a timeline, and it does require resources, and we need to be cognizant of where that should lie. But just support the idea of possibly exploring that. Supervisor Van Cray, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could a maybe easy place to start be with the grant-funded programs and positions? Like I've worked in that world before, had to code all of my hours to what I was working on, so you can report back and prove you're doing the work of the grant. Same with expenses and that sort of thing. So that, I'm assuming, already exists in our grant positions.
I think that's a good point, with one caveat. A lot of the grants only allow for direct costs to be billed against the grant, so you don't capture. I think this is again a point that Supervisor Dickinson has raised before about our ability to allocate indirects towards grants. Are we really capturing the true cost of the work that we're doing? So yes, we can look at grant positions or grant activities perhaps easier, but again, I'm not sure that the approach for all of the grant activities is going to be consistent with the allocation of all indirect costs. But I can look at a number of approaches, and I'll reach out to my colleagues on a more broad state level if this is the will of the whole committee.
Supervisor Robinson?
In talking to former Administrator Carger, he pointed out the problem that we had with priority-based budgeting was garbage in, garbage out, and that we really lacked the fundamental breakdown of cost and other information. So I would caution for us to jump right to priority-based budgeting. I think what we need to do is understand the capacity and capabilities of Workday to provide us with that underlying data. And toward that end, I think this is a staged or stepped process. For first you understand the capacity of your system, and then you determine how that fits into your planning needs. I think that's going to take some time. I know that there was a lot of frustration when the state rolled out PeopleSoft. There was a lot of adjustments and failures and other things. So if you don't give it the time and the thought and the lead in, you'll have problems on the back end. But with that in mind, I would move to direct administration to investigate strategies to develop approaches relative to specific expense and revenue data, and report back by July 1 of 2024.
Okay, with that motion, is there a second? Second by Vice Chair McEwen. Further discussion? Supervisor Dickinson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify the thought about programs and services, like we were talking about in infrastructure, it wasn't my request to get the costs for every program or service that we have, but if that's the route that committees are being asked to go to, then we have to provide them with the information to make those decisions. So we don't have to go that route. I'm not necessarily of the opinion that we need to provide the supervisors with all of this detailed information down to the most minor thing. But if we're going to go to a higher level, then we have to allow for that higher level vision to be able to take place. And that would be one of those statements like X amount of % off of each department, et cetera, or add a % to that department, take 1 away from here. So just wanted to clarify that.
Other discussion? Okay. All those, we'll proceed to vote. All those in favor of the motion to give direction to administration to provide a report of strategies in developing that program expense and revenue data by July 1 of 2024, signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, say no. I'm sorry.
No.
Okay. The motion carries, but is not unanimous. Okay, and we will then move on to item number 6A4. And this was a request by a supervisor that we look at the objective 3.8 in the comp plan, in how it was included in the work of each of the standing committees. And so I provide that direction to each of the standing committees to look at their roles and responsibilities as spelled out in their duties, and then also how it relates to 3.8 of the comp plan, and look at providing a report back to the executive committee, which is Committee of Oversight, by September. Supervisor Zhang is on if he wants to address the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's nothing more for me. I'm just looking for a report back from all standing committees.
Okay, thank you. Any questions by the standing committee chairs? Okay. We will move on then to item 6B1. 6B is a discussion and possible action by the executive committee to forward to the county board for consideration. Item 6B1 is a resolution to approve the charter for a tax incremental finance task force. And that came from HR Finance. Supervisor Robinson, you want to address the request?
Sure. The issue of tax increment financing and its impact on the county has been been at about for 3+ years at the HR, Finance, and Property Committee, and their Supervisor Rosenberg, the older Supervisor Rosenberg, had raised a number of concerns relative to this back years ago. And I think some of the questions are, what is the county's role in the Joint Review Board? What criteria should we be applying to evaluate both the creation of tax increment districts and in the extension of those districts and the donor districts and other caps? There's no authority. So we thought it might be helpful to do an evaluation of the tax increment districts in Marathon County, how it's impacting us. We've got $14 billion of valuation. $1 billion of that is within tax increment districts, where the incremental growth goes to pay off the investment in those properties. And that, in many cases, is a very good thing for not only the community, but for the county. But I think that what there was a concern is, should Christie be our representative on the Joint Review Board, or should it be somebody from the EDC committee? Who should that be? What criteria should we apply to it? And that this task force is being proposed to bring in not only members of the county board, but allow other people in the business community and communities that are affected to have the discussion about where we're going with tax incremental districts and tax incremental financing, get a better understanding of how it does impact us. And while we, people are taxed upon that valuation, but it goes to the local unit of government. There continually are requests to extend those districts beyond the statutory limit. In some cases, we're not aware of the request to change until after the change is made. What should the county's role be, and have a discussion. This does have an impact upon the taxpayers of the county, because it shifts. While we can enjoy the increment in the levy, we can't we don't get that money, so it shifts the responsibility to the remaining taxpayers. And I think it's something that we would just benefit from having additional information.
I think the other thing that, and I support the creation of a task force, but just so there's also, continued legislation. And in fact, there's legislation that's being discussed as we speak about a potential increase in TIF legislation, allowing the creation of TIFs outside of the levy limit that's imposed right now on TIFs in municipalities to create housing. And we all know that there's a housing shortage, but and it's in conjunction with developers, but totally understanding how that's going to potentially impact us long term is something that I think that the task force could look at. And what is the county's response, if any, in either supportive or not supportive of those potential TIF changes? So with that, I'll open it up for additional questions. Any additional questions? Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Besides Christie, who's on this committee that approves these TIF districts?
Well, the Joint Review Board is made up of one member from the county, one member from municipality, and one citizen members on that Joint Review Board, and inside the taxing, the county, school district, and the tech.
Their decision is final. There's nothing the county or anyone else has to
Right, whatever decision they make, the majority rules, and I don't know that there's any appeal process that I'm aware of.
Thank you.
Other discussion? Supervisor Van Cray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This might be a question for you, John. What is the reason for creating a task force versus having the Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee do this work? I think we heard from a lot of our colleagues that them and their constituents were kind of against the idea of a task force, and we're looking for committees to put the work in. So could you elaborate on that?
I think there are two reasons. One is workload for the Human Resources Finance Property Committee, and the second is trying to get different viewpoints to the table, and probably more importantly, trying to get different viewpoints to the table. And we can't do this in a vacuum, and we want to make sure that we're hearing what the concerns are and why, what the municipality's perspective is. I think that this would be, by having the task force, you can bring in non-county board members, local officials. I know that there are individuals in the city of Wausau that are interested in what we are doing here from the community development perspective. This would create that opportunity for that discussion. And we had a 3-hour meeting yesterday.
Go ahead. Supervisor Van Craig, please
Thank
continue.
you. Just a follow-up from a comment you made earlier. You referenced the older Supervisor Rosenberg, but I think you might need to be more specific.
It would be the younger, older Supervisor Rosenberg, and that it was Jim Rosenberg, the father of the current mayor, if that puts it. But he had, for years, and he and I have had recent discussions, but he said it would be helpful if there was a term sheet or a description of what's the payback period, what's the return on investment, and other things. And I think that those would be potentially suggestions or requests that the county might want to make at the time of the creation of the district or the amendment, and just for better transparency and understanding of the implications. But I'll let him speak for himself. But this was an issue that he had raised a number of times during his tenure on the county board years ago.
And I struggle with trying to do this by the committee if you don't bring in outside individuals from other municipalities and or the business community and give them an equal, or at least an equal voice on the committee, in this case the task force. I don't know that you get buy-in from the communities, and so that was the reason I supported the creation of a task force, understanding that we needed to have that buy-in for understanding. Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't disagree that with the task force. It's the fact is I would hope the task force would be favorable to the counties. But what are we going to do with our decision if they got the last say on it? We could, task force could have a recommendation and that would be fine, and they move on to their next meeting. I mean, if we don't have any, this is not going to influence them.
Supervisor Robinson?
I would see several outcomes from this. One is a heightened awareness and understanding on the part of all the players, and the county does have that seat on there. But hopefully, as a result of the decision, we may develop recommendations or criteria that we would apply to whoever our representative is. I think one of the things that the discussion should make a recommendation on is who should represent the county. Is it the finance director? Is it somebody from EDC? Is it somebody from finance or HR finance? Who should that person be? And then it could also develop the points of discussion within the community, the appropriateness, and it could lead to potentially suggestions on changes in legislation on a statewide level. All, which is well beyond our control, but we could make those recommendations if we saw some concerns or had some concerns as a result of it. So we would educate, we would modify our own policies or develop policies, which we really don't have, and then we could potentially make suggestions relative to changes in legislation.
I think the other thing that it provides is the opportunity to create the criteria that we use when evaluating the extension of TIDs. When they are offered, at least we have explained why we felt that, yes, we support the extension, but we have criteria that we're using to evaluate that extension. whether we support the exceeding the valuation limits or the use of donor TIDs. And I think it behooves us to actually have defendable criteria that we're using to analyze what position the county's taking. Supervisor Langenhan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd move that we approve the resolution approve the charter for the Tax Incremental Finance Task Force and forward it to the Marathon County Board for its consideration.
Okay, there's a motion to approve the charter and the creation of the task force and move it to the full board for its consideration. Second by Supervisor Robinson. Any further discussion? Supervisor Dickinson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Who makes the appointments then?
That is by statute, or that's by our ordinances, the chair makes the appointments. But confirmed by the full board.
Okay, thanks.
Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor of the motion to approve the creation of the task force, TIF incremental task force, and move to the full board for its consideration, signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, say no. No. Motion is carried, but it also is not unanimous. Thank you. And we will move on to next meeting date and time and announcements. Any announcements from the committee? Committee members are asked to bring ideas for future discussion. And the next committee meeting is scheduled for July 13th, 2023, 3 o'clock. And we're down to item number 9, motion by Vice Chair McEwen. Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Langenhan to adjourn. All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.